But if we have no coral reefs, if our rivers have just filthy and polluted and our oceans are full of plastic, and that's not a world worth living in. And so there's no point in creating a world where we've helped people that have a ton of money but not have a world worth living in.
Welcome to the very first episode of the Rebalance Earth podcast. I'm Walid Al-Sakaf, co-founder of Rebalance Earth, your host. I'm very excited to introduce you to this new platform where we'll explore innovative ideas, thought leadership, and the future of nature as an asset class. Throughout this podcast, we'll dive into the critical role nature plays in building resilient businesses, cities, and societies. Each episode will feature experts and leaders who are driving change in sustainability, finance, and climate innovation. Our mission is to challenge traditional business paradigms and shine a light on the opportunities to invest in nature. So whether you're an investor, a corporate leader, or just passionate about nature as an investable asset class, stay tuned for insightful conversations that can help us rethink the future of business and of nature. Now let's get this first episode started. Rob, welcome to this first episode of the Rebalance Earth podcast. Could you give us a little introduction on yourself?
Well, Walid, I'm excited to be here. I love your first podcast, so excited what this can be. So a bit about me, where I came from?
Correct.
Yeah, I suppose let me begin at the beginning. I was born in Holland, which is important because I was technically born below sea level. And so from a very early age, as a toddler, I think I was aware of the idea, not of climate change, but the idea that the sea could rise and flood Holland. So I have this kind of memory going all the way back to, under the age of 3. My mum and dad taught all over the world. And what that meant is that I lived in Holland, lived in Argentina, my parents lived in the Middle East. And the so what of that is I've always had a passion for travel. And I'm fascinated about the world. Why is Buenos Aires in Buenos Aires? Why is London in London? Why is The Hague in The Hague? And what that meant is I went on to study geography. And so I can say it now, but I couldn't say it for a long time, but I'm a proud geographer. One of the best decisions I've ever made is kind of studying geography. And I remember because I was doing maths, physics, chemistry, which is what my mum and dad did. And my geography teacher convinced me to do geography. He said, look, you're really good at it. You love it. And then he convinced me to go and do geography at university. And I think it's one of the best bits of career advice that I have. And then for the last 25 years, I've worked in this amazing city. I've worked in investment banking. I've set up a pensions consultancy. I've worked in pensions and asset and wealth management. So I've got 25 years of working in the world of finance, how money flows. And now, working with you, Walid, we get to connect two things I love, kind of finance and nature. And, as you know, my kind of catchphrase is, how do we create a world worth living in?
Actually, I was going to come back to that phrase, how do you get to a world worth living in? How did that phrase come up in the first place? And what is its origin? And did it exist in some shape or form from your childhood, whether it was from Holland or from, your time in South America? Tell me the origins of that phrase.
Yeah, probably 2015. I actually first heard it used at a Dutch pension fund conference. So it was actually the CEO of a Dutch pension fund who was talking about not just deriving financial returns and how important it is to create financial returns, to create financial security for their members, but what's the point in doing that if we don't have a world worth living in? And so I remember the first time I heard it and it kind of really stuck with me and resonated. There's a guy called Roger Irwin who's very well known, works at Willis Towers Watson and works with some of the biggest asset owners around the world. And so I was fascinated by this idea and thought that just makes total sense. So just to sort of step back, at the time I was working at Reddington, the company I'd co-founded with Dawid, and the purpose of Reddington was how do we make 100 million people financially secure, which is all great. And so when this guy at the Dutch pension fund said it. I said, you're totally right. What is the point? If I can help you have €1 million to retire on, which may sound like a lot, but if that needs to last 30 years, it isn't a lot. It gives you a comfortable income in retirement, but not a wealthy one. But if we have no coral reefs, if our rivers have just filthy and polluted and our oceans are full of plastic, and that's not a world worth living in. And so there's no point in creating a world where we've helped people that have a ton of money but not have a world worth living in. And so, that's always struck me. And then as a result, Reddington updated their purpose statement. And, when I went on to St. James's Place, that's always what's guided me. I've been passionate about helping people understand money, how to earn it, keep it, and grow it, and how money can be a force for good. Because at the same time, I think it's so important to have a world worth living in.
So you touched on some important points: money, finance, nature. They're usually not seen as two things that work well together. How do you make them work well together? Because if we look at the story of nature, it's always been one of philanthropy. The money, it was the money you had it in the sofa, right? You would donate it. But if you want to build a world worth living in, you need more than just the coins behind that sofa. So how do you unlock that?
Yeah, and again, I think I'm sort of very lucky. Sort of 45 years of age, 25 years of working in finance in the city has enabled me to sort of connect these worlds. You think about what makes you who you are, and obviously your parents are a huge part of that, where you grew up, where you went to school, who you went to school with, where you started your career. And just as an aside, I'm passionate about teaching people about money. And what I realized in my mum and dad that, they were hardworking, good at earning money. They were really good savers. They kept their money, but they didn't know how to grow their money. It wasn't until I started my career in banking and finance that I understood that you could own shares in companies like Microsoft and Google, and that actually, if you can stay the course, if you can invest for long term, you can actually grow your money. And all of a sudden, I felt like someone had shown me the keys to this magic kingdom. Now I understood why wealthy people get wealthier and people who don't understand it, which is why I've been so passionate about teaching this simple concept of earn it, keep it, and grow it to as many people as possible. So once you understand this kind of abstract world of finance, why is it that you're able to grow your money? And what people do is they invest in assets. And at a very base level, something that has an asset has one or more of the following three criteria. So it needs to have utility, sometimes scarcity, and you need to be able to generate a cash flow. So, for example, if we were to go and buy a property as utility, we could rent it out so people could have a podcast show like this or workspace. That's how they generate a cash flow. They rent it out. And obviously stuff like Airbnb has enabled it to make it really easy for people even to rent out their own home. And then thirdly, so scarcity. Obviously, a property in the south of France is going to be more valuable than a home in the middle of a town in the middle of England. So when you think about these things, you start to understand what makes something an asset and what makes something valuable. And the challenge with nature is it has sat outside of that sort of framing. So we go, a property is an asset, infrastructure is an asset, owning shares or bonds is an asset, but we don't think of nature as an asset. And therefore, if we're going to solve this problem, if we're going to try and drive money into restoring nature at scale, we need to kind of reconceptualize nature as an asset class. Now, some people might listen to this and go, well, that sounds awful. We should value the thing that is most precious to everything, to our entire existence. But the truth is we don't. And one argument is we could rip up the entire economic system. I think that's going to be too hard. I think there are 8 billion people who are locked into a capitalist system. And so, my personal philosophy is, how do we take capitalism and change the inputs and the outputs and then redirect it? How do we re-wiggle capitalism to make it be a force for good? And so that is the kind of the sort of highest level sort of philosophy about how we connect finance and nature.
So let's focus on this re-wiggling, because I'm sure we're going to use that term a couple of times in this podcast.
There's a lot of re-wiggling.
Exactly. But in terms of finance, at its basic element, finance does it care where it goes? What are the indicators that will lead finance to go in one direction instead of another? Obviously, it's not what is the right thing to do instead of what's the wrong, because that obviously has not worked. So how does money knows where to go?
Yeah, I think that's why I'm not downbeat on capitalism. I think capitalism is just a framework for allocating capital, and there are inputs and outputs that are derived by us as humans, and capitalism is just a tool to move money around the world. In the same way that a knife is a tool, I need a knife to cook my food, to cook dinner. A knife is extremely useful. It can also be used to do some really nasty things as well. And so capitalism goes and flows where you make the most money. And therefore, if you have a system that says, well, it's okay to pollute lots and you don't carry the cost of that pollution, and if you can make stuff and those negative externalities aren't priced in and you make a lot of money, it's going to flow that way. If all of a sudden we start to price in negative externalities and that impacts my rate of return, it will flow elsewhere. And so money just seeks out, how does it make a return on investment? And therefore, we need to shift from a world where up until now you can make a return on investment where those negative externalities weren't borne by you. I mean, it's crazy that the largest company in Europe, the most valuable company in Europe, makes a drug that helps people who are obese lose weight. And look, obesity is a relatively recent concept in human history, right? And we have a food system that is designed to give us more sugar, to give us more processed food. So it's all back to front. And to me, that's what I mean by sort of rewiggling the sort of financial system to one where actually, who doesn't want to be healthy? Well, to be healthy, we need to eat good, healthy food. So we need to not have a food system that is full of pesticides and fertilizers. We need to have an education system that gets young people to understand, to be fit and healthy, you need to eat fresh food, ideally locally sourced. When we do that, it has less negative externalities to the planet. It's also better for our health. And in that world, guess what? We don't need drugs to help us lose weight. And in that world, a company that makes drugs of people's pains doesn't exist. And then companies that kind of do good should be more successful. So fundamental to this idea is this idea of profit pools and value pools. And once we start pricing in negative externalities, the companies that make money off that should do less well. And the companies that sort of create value that aren't extractive in nature should do a lot better. And that's the opportunity. And that's the thing that kind of keeps me optimistic. People often say to me, like, how are you so optimistic when you know what's going to happen or could happen?
I was going to ask you just that. How are you so optimistic? Because if you look at the world in which you and I are working in, which involves entrepreneurs like ourselves, which involves policymakers, which involves scientists, my understanding it is one where these are people who are quite depressed in general, and because of the size of the challenge. So how come you're the exception to the rule? What keeps you optimistic?
Well, I think, look, being an entrepreneur is really hard, and we could have a separate conversation about that. You have to be slightly crazy to want to kind of leave the safe route of employment and set out and do that. And I'm very lucky. I've got a mentor called Mike Harris. He's famous. He basically invented First Direct, the first telephone banking, which had no bank branches. He invented Egg, the first internet bank. And one of the questions he always says is, how are you feeling? And I think if you're too optimistic, everything's great, everything's awesome, like the Lego movie, that's not good. And if you're too depressed, that's not good. So I think it's getting balanced. I'm not saying I am balanced, and obviously my feelings go up and down every day, but it's trying to sort of be in the middle. It's trying to be the realist, not the optimist, not the pessimist, but the realist. And then I think the second thing is about agency. What can I do to make this better? And the exciting thing for me is I feel that because of my geography degree, I don't want to pretend I'm a climate scientist. I don't want to pretend I'm a soil expert. I understand a little bit about hydrology and glaciology, but it was a long time ago. But I do understand how that world connects. And I'm very lucky I've got 25 years in finance. And so I think, well, actually, there's something I can go and do about it. So rather than feeling like I'm a victim of all of this, I feel excited about what can happen. And although the KPIs on our planetary health have got a lot worse in, let's say, the last 5 years, I would say at the same time there are other things that give me hope, and that's basically how I strike a balance.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit more. So you have the desire, you want to have a positive impact. Is it 2015? You realized, the expression, world worth living in. You've created Red Star. You created Reddington. You worked at SGP. What has brought you to this point where you said, I can now make a difference? I'm going to launch Rebalance Earth. And how is Rebalance Earth's proposition different to what everyone else has been doing up to now, which is, how do you price those externalities? How do you get companies, as you know, carbon credits, BNG units, batteries? They're all tackling this issue of how do you get finance into nature. What is so special about the approach you're taking with Rebalance? And perhaps if you can walk us through that, please.
Well, first of all, I met you, so that's a big part of it. I don't think it wasn't like a eureka moment. So actually at Reddington, off the back of that comment, I worked with a guy called Mark Thompson at HSBC and created a new way of investing, which became the Future World Fund for Legal and General Investment Management. It was a sort of a different way of investing that we designed for the HSBC pension fund. And that was in 2015. It launched in November 2016. So already back then, I was thinking about how money can be a force for good. In 2018, when I left to join SJP in 2019, I was like, well, how can I take all of these ideas from the last 5 years and implement it? And when I joined SJP, I was responsible for 100 billion pounds. And when I left, there was 150 billion pounds. And we were able to sign up to the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ. We not only made a net zero commitment, we made 2025 commitments, and we did that 3 years early. And we didn't do that just by divesting, and we did that across emerging markets, and we did that across property. And actually, even today, 2 years on, the work that we did at SJP is still regarded as leading edge. So I wouldn't say suddenly Rebalance Earth got to this point, but it was at COP26. It was the first time you and I met in person. We'd met on Zoom a few times. A couple of things kind of maybe just clicked or came into sharp focus. One was that sort of WWF stat about how we've lost 70% of our wildlife since 1970. I'd seen it before. For whatever reason, it hadn't registered in the same way. The second thing was that was probably the first time I'd heard of sort of Isabella Tree and this concept called rewilding. And at COP26, people were saying, it's great that we're talking about climate and it's great that we're talking about net zero, but what about biodiversity? And what about natural capital? And the reason we'd been connected, I think 2 or 3 people connected at us at the same time. You were already working with Ralph Charmy during lockdown. I'd come across some of his work about what is the value of a whale, what is the value of an elephant. And I just got fascinated by this idea that restoring nature could be a powerful way to address climate change, as well as the very sort of tech-driven approach, which was obviously all about renewables and batteries and electric vehicles. And I suppose I'm more intuitively, if I'm honest, more intuitively drawn to how nature can be a solution than how technology can be a solution. And then just once you understand that, and then once you understand that it's a huge financing gap, you go, well, that's what banks and asset managers have done before. When there's something that needs to be financed, it's what the Italian bankers did in the Middle Ages. The very birth of modern banking is you've got to have a belief that tomorrow will be better than today, because otherwise you never lend any money. And so thinking through that and go, well, what do we need to do to make it attractive to deploy capital in restoring nature? And that led me to deciding to quit my job at SJP and, join you at Rebalance Earth. But, even that hasn't been plain sailing, right? The proposition of Rebalance Earth today is very different to what it was sort of 2 years ago.
Exactly. And I really want to go back to that point, because how do you attract the amounts of capital that is required to really change our approach to nature? Obviously, the approach of financing ecosystem services of keystone species, whilst is a good effort, it is not one that was fit for market requirements. And I think with reflection, which is always a lot easier, a lot of the projects, including the one we had at Rebalance Earth at the beginning, it was very much of a case of we will build it and hope they will come. Do you want to perhaps elaborate a little bit about that approach and how you helped us to pivot into a more market-driven approach, where we're flipping it not from the nature perspective, but from the business perspective?
Well, I think if my daughter's school teachers here, they would add an important word, which is yet. So I do think we need to pay for ecosystem services. Correct. And I think it was just the market wasn't ready. I mean, we got to remember, we invented solar panels back in I don't know whether it was in the 1950s or 60s, but it's only really in the last decade that they've really taken off. And obviously lots of people have been thinking about payment for ecosystem services in Costa Rica, debt for nature swaps, and as you say, up until now, the main source of capital in this space has been philanthropic. I think this is where I think there's the sort of the big picture thinking, the academic thinking meets the harsh reality of being an entrepreneur. And I think when you're an entrepreneur, you're typically building a product or service. You're either building a product or service to compete with others that already exist. So it's really all about differentiation. How's your product or service better at meeting the needs of that client? What's the value proposition? Or it's something brand new and it hasn't been done before. And so just as an aside, when Dowd and I set up Reddington, we were the former. People already had investment consulting. We were just trying to build a better investment consulting firm. We then built another business called Mallow Street, which was a bit like a social media world for pension funds. That was completely unheard of. There was no other Mallow Street. And so that was a brand new idea. In both those cases, and for any entrepreneur listening, one of the most important things you need to go through is the kind of, what is the problem you're trying to solve? What is the solution? And how are you going to implement that? And when you think about the problem, you really need to think about who's your customer, who's your audience, and what are their pains, needs, and gains. And I think too often businesses jump very quickly from that problem, pain, need, gain, that kind of propositional stage, and jump straight to solution or jump straight to implementation. And so we might say that at that point in time, we thought, hey, we've got this brilliant insight from Ralph Charmy, elephants are valuable, whales are valuable, we can put a price of carbon. We've got this amazing technology called, blockchain or distributed ledger technology. We've got satellite data. How hard can it be? We just put it all together, and as you say, people will buy it. And I think, and by the way, many businesses make this mistake. And the pivot needs to be, well, we should have started with who's going to buy this and why, and what do they need, and what problems do they solve. But if I'm honest, when I quit my job, I didn't think that you or Rebalance Earth at the time had the answer. I just knew I wanted to be all in this space. And I think, I'm not saying that we've got it right now. I think, like everything, it will iterate. But the key pivot has been exactly that. And it's just a function of speaking to lots and lots of people, right? If you have 25 to 30 meetings every week for a year, you end up speaking to a lot of people and you get a lot of feedback about what people are interested in. And I think what became clear is, certainly the people we were talking to, is that they wanted to deploy money in the UK. Mm-hmm. It's far more, there's a reason why up until so 20 years ago, most people would invest in their domestic market. So UK pension funds invest in the UK, Australian pension funds invest in Australia, Canadian pension funds invest in Canada, because people like to touch and see things. It's why people like investing in property. Oh, I can see a house, I can see that warehouse. And so forest elephants or whales are just too intangible. The second thing is carbon is too intangible. We know that climate change and carbon dioxide is a huge problem, but it doesn't really engage or resonate with people. And so the question is, in order to get money flowing, we need to make nature as an asset class. And therefore, we needed to go, well, who is going to pay for nature and why? And in the UK, because that's where we were kind of being funneled to because of our audience, the biggest problems are actually to do with water, flooding. It is just a huge issue. And it's almost like every day I come across a new fact or story about just how bad it is or how it's getting even worse. The second is actually counterintuitively the lack of water. One form of that is drought, but a lot of us need to extract water to build new homes, to make stuff, to make glass, to make paper mills, to build new data centers. The third thing is water quality. I mean, water quality is just a huge, huge problem in the UK that we need to tackle. And actually, once you have a big problem, remember problem, solution, implementation, what you then need to do is go, which businesses are losing money as a result of that, or which businesses are highly dependent on water, because then all of a sudden fixing that problem becomes very valuable.
Yeah. And really, as you said, carbon is so intangible, water isn't. When it floods, you're walking in it. And in cases of drought, the soil tells you the whole story. So who would pay for reducing those risks, in your opinion?
Yeah, so then a lot of people like to say, well, actually, to solve this, you need systems thinking, and you do need systems thinking. But I always like to go really small and micro, or go down to the smallest level. And so again, if we zoom in the UK, we happen to be working on projects in Plymouth. We're also working on in Manchester and other areas. Is you can then start to identify businesses that have suffered in the last 12 months a loss of money, or either because they've lost revenues or they've had to replace assets that have been damaged by flooding or have been impacted by the lack of water. And so, that can be a factory. Flooding of that factory means it can't operate. Actually, flooding of the access road to that factory means it can't either get its inputs in or its people into work, or it can't get its product out. And the moment you do that, suddenly the clock's ticking because they're losing revenue.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, this becomes an issue for the CFO, the chief financial officer, not the chief sustainability issue. And all of a sudden, this is a problem right here, right now, not a 2050 problem. And I think that it's important to just pause and underline that thing. And having worked sort of 20 years in pensions, humans are very bad at thinking long term. That's why most people don't save for their pension. That's why there's a proverb that says the best time to start saving for your pension was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. We know the same is true for health. What will determine our health 20 years from now is how we eat, how we sleep, how we exercise today, and what we do over the next 20 years. And so bringing it from 2050 right here, right now is extremely important. Making it an issue where it's got a direct impact on revenues, costs, profit and loss makes it tangible. And then you can go across and say, well, who else does that impact? Well, guess what? Flooding impacts railway lines, it impacts roads, it impacts people's homes. And actually, one of the things that we know is that insurance is becoming prohibitively expensive. And, the cost of insurance has been rising, and it doesn't really get much exposure. If you think about, we've been talking about cost of living and inflation. One of the things that's keeping inflation up is insurance costs. And actually, even worse, some people, even here in the UK, can't get insurance for their home, You've had announcements like Nationwide saying that they won't provide mortgages to people's homes. People forget that if you want to buy a house, you need to typically borrow money for 30 years, and the working assumption is that you can insure it. You can't even be confident that that's going to happen. So all of a sudden, you've got a real financial pain. And when there's a real financial pain and people are already paying for insurance, then if you can come along and say, well, I can reduce that flood risk for you, then actually that becomes an attractive proposition. The same can be to, let's say we make glass. In order to make glass, I need good, clean running water. Let's say we run a paper mill factory. In order to make paper, I need good, clean water all the year round. Let's say I'm a property developer. Even once I've got planning permission, I still need to be able to connect that to the water. And so I think water is probably the most mispriced asset. And maybe, the insight is, if we were talking about what's the value of a whale or what's the value of an elephant, it's really what's the value of water. And what does that mean to each business? And what's the value of clean water in the right place at the right time? And how can we work with businesses to do that, but not just using cement and engineered solutions, but actually using nature-based solutions. And when we do all of this, we can then also piggyback off the financial markets and how they grew the entire renewable market. People forget that 20 years ago, we didn't have wind farms.
Yeah.
So go back to 2004, the idea of building wind farms was as crazy as, electric cars or
rewiggling a river.
Or rewiggling a river. And so, exactly that. And then the byproduct of all of this is that we will create a whole load of biodiversity uplift, and we'll create a load of carbon credits. And as the world starts to change and price in those negative externalities, we'll have created an asset that has value. But our starting point is really addressing that water problem here in the UK.
So you mentioned the wind farms, the EV vehicles. It took decades. You're talking to a CFO, you're explaining to him or her their financial risk from flooding, from drought. They're not going to think about fixing the river as the solution. As you said, yes, insurance premiums are going up, but it is something they're comfortable. It's a known thing. Steel and cement also is a known thing. So there's those existing solutions that they feel comfortable with that they'll automatically revert to, even though it's getting more expensive. Then the second thing they might revert to is to say, well, why should I be fixing this? Isn't this something for the government to do? How do you're talking to a CFO is giving you those kind of objections. How would you get them to start thinking river wiggling could be the answer for you?
Yeah, so I think just to step back, I think, again, if you're the CFO, you're beginning to understand this problem, and you're probably thinking, this problem is a lot worse than it was 10 years ago. So the calculation you're having to make as a CFO is this problem going to be the same in 5 years' time, 10 years' time? Is it going to be worse, or is it going to be better? Depending on that, you might say, well, maybe I move my factory.
Correct.
Maybe I move my office or my house. Maybe I spend money on physical defenses. Maybe I just accept that I'm paying insurance and they keep going up. And you're right. So there are three solutions available right now, and the CFO is thinking about them. And or the COO, it's an operational risk. This is not a sustainability risk in the sense that when we think about Chief Sustainability Officer. Now, you're right. They're not thinking, well, why don't I re-wiggle the river? Now, the interesting thing about re-wiggling the river, but it's not just that, it's a whole of catchment approach. We want to basically use nature to slow down the flow of water through the system. Re-wiggling the river is part of that. Wetting peatlands is part of that. Working with farmers to move to regenerative farming, not just because it's better for our health and for the soil, but actually because healthy soils store more water. So it's this kind of cumulative effect. So we now need to present a new solution. Remember, problem, solution, implementation. So we need to say, okay, well, have you thought about this? No one company, the CFO of that factory, is not going to pay to re-wiggle the river.
Correct.
Well, why should he or she pay for that? So that's point one. Point two is I've never heard of re-wiggling. Does it work? So we need to kind of convince people of the science of hydrology and geomorphology, and why will it work, and will it make the problem worse elsewhere? And then thirdly, who's going to pay? And I think there are two aspects of who's going to pay. And this is where the sort of pension funds and asset owners come in, because then all of a sudden this feels like an infrastructure project to me. This feels like something like a wind farm or like solar panels, which requires a whole load of upfront costs to get it going. But if you think about renewable energy, that energy is renewable by definition. It's free from there on. You've paid for all of that upfront capex. Yes, there's some ongoing maintenance, but after that, every day the wind blows or every day the sun shines, you're making free energy. And so the financial model is someone says, well, I'm going to pay you an income stream in return for making that upfront capital payment. And there are lots of financial structures, typically some kind of offtake agreement, something like a power purchasing agreement, where someone says, well, I pay for it up front, and then I want a 25-year contract. So this is where the pension funds come in, because pension funds are used to investing in infrastructure. They're used to funding stuff like the M6 toll road, or funding renewable energy such as offshore wind 20 years ago. And so if we can get the pension funds to provide the capital to re-wiggle the river, then what we need to do is, in the same way that the renewable energy market did it, is create these offtake agreements. Or actually think of it as building a shopping center and having a lease. And so then it's about saying, well, what is the payment for that reduced flood risk? What is the payment for good clean water all year round? Can we agree that? Now, all of a sudden, we can now build a financial model. We know how many businesses are impacted by flooding, lack of water that needs to be cleaned. We have an ability to invest in nature restoration to positively impact those. And then we need to agree a series of bilateral contracts with those companies to pay. And then all of a sudden, it looks like everything else that we have financed for a long time. And actually is no more complicated than, in the 1950s and 60s when we were trying to finance, offshore oil and gas, or oil and gas in the developing world. So in that sense, it's not that hard. The hard thing, though, is, and from the CFO's perspective, actually the solution is a lot cheaper.
Okay.
I'm just paying part of my solution. But I think it's worth calling out the elephant in the room, which is that this is subject to the free rider problem, or what I call the collective action problem, which is kind of we all need to be in it together. As a parent, with two girls at primary school, the conversation is always about mobile phones. When should they have mobile phones? Well, that parent lets that child, and then all of a sudden you're fighting a losing battle. And so it's kind of the same here, which is if we had a magic wand and say, well, why wouldn't we do this? And it's fair. Well, the contract will be priced relative to the value of the asset. It will be priced relative to your revenues and relative to your costs. So it's not like when we go out for dinner and, I have the starter, the main, dessert, I order a glass of wine, and you just have a main course and a glass of water, and we say, let's split the bill. That's not fair.
Yeah.
So we can definitely devise a system that says, well, I pay for what I benefit, and you pay for what you benefit. But we do need certainly the big companies to be paying for that. By the way, once we've done that, and once people see this, then it becomes a no-brainer. But that is the point that we're at right now, where we need to get enough companies, because I think there are a number of companies that see this. There are already companies that have explored nature-based solutions. But what hasn't happened is trying to do this at scale and getting the private capital, not the kind of either grant money from the government or philanthropic capital, to then deploy it at scale and make those changes, and then help those companies achieve their resilience, their operational resilience to flooding, to drought, to water quality. And then the cool thing is when we do that, all of the kind of nature-based uplifts that we're going to do, the re-wiggling, the re-wetting, the nature-positive farming or regenerative farming, all naturally brings back nature, brings back biodiversity, and all naturally pulls back carbon, but in a way that is symbiotic with nature, because we're not trying to do it with a single species, or a single habitat. We're doing it in a way that says, well, some of it's going to come from the wetland restoration. Some of it's going to come because our hedgerows are going to grow back. Some of it's going to come back because, we're going to have farmers who plant trees on their land and let farm in a less intensive way, but in a more nature positive way. And actually, all of a sudden, I think, 5-10 years from now, people will start having to pay for carbon, not because it's voluntary, but because it's mandatory. It might not be mandatory, but I just think that reputationally, I think it'll be too hard not to do it properly. And I think there's a much greater willingness from companies actually to want to pay for their carbon near where it's come from. So if I'm in Manchester, I want to buy stuff that's within 50-mile radius of where I am. If I'm in Plymouth, I want to buy stuff from Plymouth. And actually, I think the opportunity here is a win-win situation where councils end up having a more resilient city. The people who live there just have a nicer place to live. And people's homes and people's businesses are more resilient. And we've created an ecosystem where that's paid for and funded in the same way that we've created an ecosystem to build new roads or build new ports or build, renewable energy. We can now do the same for nature.
And I'd love to get your vision of what success looks like in 15 or 20 years' time even. But before we go there, we talk about the pension industry quite a few times. You have a background in it. And as it was recently announced in the FT, Rebalancers received an investment from a pension company. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, and why did you feel that going to a pension investor was better than going to, let's say, a venture capitalist, which is what most startups go to?
Yeah, I think what most people hear pension and fall asleep. And having spent sort of 20 years working in pensions and saying I'm a pension consultant, I get it. But pensions are incredibly important. They provide us the secure income we need when we stop work, right? And the thing I like to say to people is that pensions, your money, everyone on this listening to this podcast, money is probably in a pension. And it's the pension funds that are the capital in capitalism. It's not JP Morgan, it's not BlackRock, it's not Bloomberg or CNBC. All of these are service providers whose job it is to take our money, save it, deploy it, and grow it so we have more money tomorrow to retire on. And the crazy thing is that when you might think, well, I only put £100 a month in my pension, but if every adult in the UK is doing that, there's billions of pounds a month flowing into these systems. And in the UK alone, if you look at our pensions and wealth system combined, it's £5 trillion. And so I think most people don't really understand that we have companies that you might work for, an HSBC or a Unilever, that have a defined benefit pension scheme. Some of you may have one of those. You probably, most of us, you and I, have a defined contribution pension fund. If you work for local government, then you might have a local government pension scheme. That's what West Yorkshire is. Some people might want to top up that, and they might, put money on a platform and invest in ISAs and in private pension. So it's quite a complicated ecosystem. But I just want you to know that's £5 trillion, and it will probably double to 9-10 trillion in just the next decade. Wow. And that money is going somewhere. It's either buying shares in Nvidia and Google and Microsoft, or it's buying property, or it's funding renewables. And the people who look after that have what's called a fiduciary duty to say, I need to be investing it to create the best return so I can provide my members with an income in retirement. But what's happened is people are starting to buy into, my words, but a version of it, a world worth living in, which is when we think about allocating our capital, we definitely don't want to be allocating our money in a way that is going to make tomorrow worse than it is today.
So like extractive industries, for example.
Yeah. And then the second thing is more and more pension funds, and this is why I'm optimistic. I mean, I was at a sustainability conference recently and just seeing the amount of money that is shifting into these new strategies, whether it's at a global equity level that are investing in the sustainable leaders and taking money away from the laggards, whether it's money that's trying to retrofit property and make it more efficient. There are so many good examples of how money can make money, but be done in a good way, and rather than a bad way. The other thing is that pension funds, if you're looking after pension fund money, you have to overcome that problem which I talked about earlier, which is short-term thinking. So if the average age in the UK is 40, 41, then that means the average age of someone in a pension fund is 40, 41. They're not going to retire until they're 65, probably 70. They might live to 100. You know, your girls, my girls have a 50% chance of living to 100. What that means is your temporal horizon is decades, not days. So when you start thinking about how do I invest that money, I'm not thinking about what's the performance going to be next year or in 3 years' time, which is how it's framed on TV and in the news. It's going to be framed, well, how's this going to stack up 10 years from now? How's this going to stack up from 20 years from now? Once you start thinking like that, then all of a sudden you start thinking about climate change. You start literally very recently start thinking about biodiversity and nature loss, and you start thinking about tipping points and how do these things cascade. And then you start thinking about, well, if we're now at 1.5 degrees C world, what does that mean for the supermarkets I hold in my portfolio? What does that mean for the car makers? What does that mean for the food producers? How are they going to be impacted by a 1.5 degrees C world? How are they going to be impacted by flooding, by drought? How are they going to be impacted by deforestation? So step one is acknowledge where I am, which is 1.5 degrees, not 1 or 1.2, but 1.5. 2 is now let's start budgeting for a world that probably looks more like 2 to 2.5. And 3, let's start doing contingency planning, which looks more like a world like 3.5 to 5 degrees C. And, you know, unfortunately, that world is pretty bleak. But that has seriously negative financial implications for your portfolio. So once you start thinking long term, and once you start thinking about these big systemic risks, you can then start thinking differently about your portfolio. And by the way, this thinking is literally only been happening over the last 4 or 5 years. And what most pension funds think about is what's the risk and return and diversification of different asset classes. It's now become more complicated because I now need to think about different climate scenarios and different nature scenarios and how things might play out in those worlds. And all of a sudden, those investments that have looked really good over the last 30, 40, 50 years, and I might assume will continue to be good, in certain scenarios will look really bad. And then actually stuff like investing in nature, stuff like investing in renewable energies, stuff that sits in the kind of camp of impact investing, so trying to drive change, will do better in certain scenarios. And once you start to do that, then they start reallocating their capital. And that has 2 profound effects. One is it provides the capital for firms like Rebalance Earth to deliver what we've been talking about. But 2, it means they're already looking through their portfolio and they're thinking, I own the supermarkets. I own food manufacturers. I own water companies. I'm going to get my fund manager to ask them some really tough questions and say, how dependent are you on water? What happens if soil quality is depleted in 10 years' time? What happens if all the bumblebees and pollinating insects are doing? What does that do? So you end up with this double sort of pressure. Now, I just want to say, look, unfortunately, there has been a culture war around ESG, and not all pension funds around the world think this way, but certainly in Europe, certainly in the UK, certainly in the Nordics, there's a real desire now not just to think about risk and return, but to think about risk, return, and impact. This idea that when we invest in those companies, the world impacts those companies, flooding, drought, fire, etc., but also how those companies act and behave impacts the world. And money can be a force for good. We can change that. We can re-wiggle the way the financial system works. Stepping into West Yorkshire Pension Fund, they've updated their investment beliefs recently, and they do what's called 3D investing, so return, risk, and impact. And they've updated their investment beliefs, and they want to also invest their money in a way that has a positive impact on sustainable cities and communities, that addresses climate change, and that supports economic growth. And so in that vein, investing in Rebalance Earth as both a startup fund manager that's trying to affect change is highly catalytic. And then second of all, investing in our funds is very mission aligned. And so the reason for going to pension funds is they think long term.
Yeah.
They think about these big strategic risks of climate change and nature loss. And this is something that we're not going to solve in a handful of years. We're not trying to build a social media company here. We're trying to build something that works with nature, and therefore you need long-term patient capital. And that's why having a long-term asset owner like a West Yorkshire Pension Fund is the right place to go, not just to invest in us as a business, but also to give us the capital to do this. And by the way, I'd love to take credit for this, but it was actually a guy called Julius Persay who works at Cushion, which is a defined contribution pension fund. And when I was talking to him a year ago, he said, Rob, when you raise money, don't raise money from venture capital, raise money from someone who is aligned with your time horizon and your mission. And he was absolutely right. Great advice from Julius.
And one thing that you related to that you talk about often is the 2% for nature. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about how that came about and what that means, especially with the 5 trillion pounds worth of assets that sits, I believe, in the pension industry? Walk us through that, please.
Yeah, so having been a sort of pension consultant, whenever you get a pension fund to invest in a new asset class, which is something that I did, I got pension funds to invest in infrastructure sort of 10, 15 years ago, is they need to update what's called their investment beliefs. Think of it as like the software on the phone when you update your phone. So they need to update their beliefs and say, we think infrastructure is an asset class. So you then need to add it in. Then you need to say, well, how much do I allocate to it? And then you need to pick your fund managers to do it. So that's the sort of process they go through. Now, a pension fund won't go through all of that trouble to allocate to an asset class that's too small. Now, you might say that 2% is too small. Really, the answer is probably 0 to 5. And some pension funds will allocate 5% and some will be 0. And so maybe on average, sort of 2%. So I've obviously sort of rounded the numbers there. But the nice thing about 2%, and there's a sort of behavioral reason for this, is it's big enough to be meaningful, but it's been small enough that if it doesn't work out, you've still got 98% of the portfolio doing everything else. And one of the biggest reasons people don't do things in life is risk, reputational risk. I don't want to look stupid. I don't get fired for hiring IBM. So part of it is like, well, if you put 2% and it doesn't work out, the worst thing you've done is you've re-wiggled some river, made it really nice to live, captured some carbon, you've got some more fish back and all that. You might not have made any money, but you've made the world a better place. So that's your downside. Now, obviously, I'd love 2% to be 4% or 5%. But the point is that 2% is a meaningful number, but it's not so meaningful that it's scary. The second reason is that 2% of 5 trillion pounds just in the UK is 100 billion pounds. That is a lot of money, and is about the amount of money that is needed in the UK over the next decade to solve the kind of biodiversity nature crisis deficit that we have. So we have a nature deficit that needs to be funded. We have a 5 trillion pound industry. And so that's where that sort of 2% for nature comes about. Now, globally, 2% of 100 trillion is even bigger.
Yeah.
It's $2 trillion, and that is definitely enough to solve this problem.
So let's talk about what success looks like in 10, 15, or 20 years for Rebalance Earth. Is it this 100 trillion global opportunity? Is it one where we focus only on the UK? We're at the beginning of our journey. We just closed this wonderful investment from West Yorkshire Pension Fund. We recently announced the MOU with Plymouth City Council. We've got some exciting projects coming up in Manchester and other locations. But we're still fundamentally at the beginning of this journey. So if you could take us 20 years in the future, what does that future look like? How does a CFO think? How does pension investor think? And how do we treat natural capital?
Well, actually, I want to say a few things. Quite often when people think of nature, they don't think of themselves as part of nature. I think of myself as part of nature. I think of you as part of nature. And I think people matter and relationships matter. And actually, this all started 15, 20 years ago because I got to know Leandros working in the pensions world. And so had I not started a relationship with Leandros 15, 20 years ago, working in pensions, not knowing I was going to do this or not knowing he was going to be the CIO of West Yorkshire Pension Fund, we wouldn't be where we are. So firstly, thanks to Leandros and Darren at West Yorkshire Pension Fund, because it takes real leadership and courage to do what they did, to kind of stand up and do something different. Too often people don't do things because it's scary. So the reason I say that is that people are part of nature, and we need people to affect change, and we need people like Kat and Tom at Plymouth City Council who are also backing us and say we want to pilot this. And look, this is the history of change, right? It wasn't until the first railway that people thought, oh wow, we don't need horse and car. It wasn't until the first cars that people thought there was a different way of doing it. And so we need our exemplar, and for exemplars to happen, we need relationships like Leandros, like Darren. We need relationships like Tom and Kat to say, let's make this happen. Let's show the world the art of the possible. Success 10, 15 years from now is, well, we've achieved the global biodiversity framework, which is 30% restoration of nature and life on land and underwater by 2030. I think that's going to be optimistic, and 50% by 2050. I actually feel more positive about the latter than the 2030 one. So that has to be the definition of success, because that means that we're trending towards a world worth living in. You and I will be 25 years older. Our daughters will be 25 years older. So it's worth sort of thinking about that. So the most important thing is the world is in a better health and state than it is today. And I think we will have got there because all of a sudden we have re-wiggled capitalism. We're no longer sort of financing and deploying capital in extractive industries and making the problem worse. And money is now flowing to make the problem better. We now have a much more circular economy. We've massively reduced our environmental footprint. And all of a sudden, nature is seen as an asset class that I can invest in and that regenerates naturally. I mean, that's the amazing thing about this planet, right? Every day there's sun, and that's free energy that we can use and powers the world. And we have the oceans and the sea that produces food and everything that we need to sustain our lives. So for me, success is that people recognize nature as an asset class. And that has been achieved because people see that nature is business critical infrastructure. It solves a problem in the same way that everything else, whether it's a pen or a laptop or an iPad, solves problems, and we pay for it. And I'm a big believer that once we pay for something, we value stuff more than when it's free. And when we do that, the benefits are huge. And the amazing thing is, research has been shown in Europe that people who live closer to healthier rivers are physically and mentally better off. We know that actually one of the best things to address the health care crisis we have in the UK is nature prescribing. We know that just people who spend more time in nature are fitter and healthier, which puts less pressure on the NHS. Success is that world where, as humans, as part of nature, we have a relationship with nature, we value nature, and we've undone a lot of the damage of the last 50 years, and we've created a world worth living in.
I can see where your optimism is coming from, and I'm aware that now we're rapidly running out of time, and I've got two last questions for you. So optimism is very contagious, which is a wonderful thing. So listeners or viewers of this show will probably want to find out how can they get involved with Rebalance Earth, or individuals thinking, well, how can I make a positive impact? I mean, we're very lucky and blessed to have some wonderful interns, for example, who've joined Rebalance Earth. So for our listeners, what advice would you give them to ride that wave of optimism?
Well, I be realistic. I think understand where we are. And so probably you're going to have to get a little bit pessimistic first, because once you open Pandora's box of climate change and nature degradation, it's pretty depressing. But I think it does start with awareness, but I think that will drive that desire for change. And then it's really about how do you skill up and what can I do? What are the small things that I can do individually? And again, as you know, I like my framework, so I have a framework for that. Look, I think the most important thing is, sorry, let me run through all of them. So where you vote matters. So think about the policies of the politicians that you're voting for. And I think, my one call to younger people is please vote. I think the right to vote is something that is incredibly important. So where you vote matters. Second, where you earn your money is extremely important. We can all choose where we want to go and work for. When 25 years ago, I wanted to go and work for BP and Shell. They had one of the best graduate programs, on the planet at the time. Smart, capable people, interesting work, rewarding work, obviously wrapped up with the challenges of climate change. And so, actually, if you think about it, where you work, your human capital over the next, for us, maybe a few decades, but for younger people, 40, 50 years can have a dramatic impact. And actually, if you start to see talent pools moving around because of that, that has a huge effect. So where you work matters. Where you save your money, which banks you save your money with. I know many charities and philanthropies are changing their banks because of the policies they have about who they lend to and where they sit on this issue. So think about which bank you use and why. How you spend your money. I think the most important thing is we should probably be consuming less. I'm not saying we need to live this sort of, super Puritan world, but just be more mindful about how you spend your money. And I think, one of the things I've learned over the last 2 years, you and I have been in what I call skinny mode, is actually that some of the most enjoyable things in life are free.
Yeah.
And actually, when you think that way, it just reframes and recalibrates things. I just came back from Switzerland with the Alpine Glacier Project, and these young people. It was just so much fun just going to the supermarket and buying baguettes and cheese and just making our sandwiches together. And you realize it doesn't have to be expensive to have fun. So where we spend our money matters. Let's try and consume less. Let's try and recycle and reuse more, and let's try and allocate our money to the brands and companies that are doing that. Where we invest our money, where you invest your money with your pension fund, where you invest your money with your ISAs really matters. It's 27 times more impactful than flying less, eating less red meat, cycling to work. So if you don't know where your money is invested, email your HR department, contact your pension provider, look it up, because your money can either be a force for good or not. And I think aligning your money and your investments with that is so, so powerful. If you want to know more, check out the sort of Make My Money Matter campaign. And then, giving back. You can give money to WWF, to the Rivers Trust. There are so many, National Trust, RSPB, but it doesn't just have to be about giving giving money. It can be about giving your time and volunteering and making an impact. So, those would be my things, where you vote, where you earn your money, where you save your money, where you spend your money, where you invest your money, and where you give your time and money back. And all of those things can be deployed in having a positive impact. And I'm a big believer in where you deploy your energy, drives where you end up in the future.
Very good point. So my last question to you is, who would you want me to interview for my next shows? Which two top guests, if you had to choose, would you want to have on the show?
That's easy. David Attenborough, of course. He's just a total legend. And every time I log onto social media, I see his name. It fills me with sort of fear. But David Attenborough, of course, is the legend who has, I think, just raised this topic in our public awareness. I think someone, like David Attenborough would be, Tony Juniper, who's done a fantastic job. I think he's a fantastic communicator. And if people haven't listened to him talk, I think that'd be great. What I want to do is, we've talked about cities and communities, and I want to talk about people. I think it would be fascinating to have Sadiq Khan on. He's the mayor of London, or if not, Andy Burnham from Manchester. So that's 3 people.
Yeah.
But Tony Juniper, Sadiq Khan, or Andy Burnham talking about resilient cities and communities, and talk about the brilliant work that's been done here in London, about sustainable urban drainage, or some of the amazing work that's been done in Manchester.
So everyone who's listening to this podcast, you now have an idea of Rob's CEO style, which is put some very high targets and we have to work our butts off to try and reach it. So Rob, it was a pleasure having you on the podcast, and I think now it's back to work.
No, well, look, thanks, Waleed. I'm so excited. For those of you who don't know, Waleed has a brilliant podcast before, so do listen to his old podcast. I think, as you know, Waleed's energy and passion is amazing. And if any of you know Andy Burnham or Sadiq Khan or Tony Juniper, please ping us a message and help them get on this podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you.